has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country.
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-Futurism.
Listeners, welcome back. This is part 2 of our interview with Will Orr-Ewing. Will, was Rory Stewart a good influence on Prince William?
Great question. I would say the early Rory Stewart was. So I don't know whether you've read much about his background, but when he was walking across Afghanistan and Iraq and leading the sort of heroic life, I think that Rory Stewart would have been a great tutor.
I would have found it very inspiring.
Yeah.
I think.
He once heard a story that he went on a date with Jemima Khan, I think. And she was so bamboozled by the fact that he just quoted the whole of Wasteland to her.
We've all been there. Yeah, well, Tom, you regard my quoting of Proof Rock as rather juvenile.
Yeah, I think Proof Rock is a spivvy thing to be quoting, I'm afraid.
Is the proof not William's like total intellectual failure? Like is
vacuity?
No, you should have seen it before Rory Stewart got to him. I'm sorry, we shouldn't say this thing about
the king.
No.
Our dear Prince, exactly. No, I mean, Rory Stewart's a good example of what we were talking about, because if you read his one of his memoirs, he talks about his dad and what a kind of tutor figure his dad was in his life. His dad apparently used to take him out to Hyde Park in the mornings before school and lay out great British battles in Hyde Park and to go through Waterloo, etc., with young Rory. So I think that is very much to be commended. And I'll always have a soft place in my heart for that Rory Stewart. I actually remember going to a lecture that he gave once, and he was saying that the big problem with the Foreign Office and the civil service is this sort of health and safety culture which is kind of encrusted around it. And he was calling at that time for a kind of special ops team of people who are willing to forego certain health and safety protections to go and do heroic acts for the country. So, that spirit in him is absolutely to be commended.
00 fast street.
What's happened to it in the last few years is another question. What do you think?
As I say, I think I think it's very easy for people to take the piss out of Rory Stewart, and they do so very often. But I think the fact is he's an intelligent man who did some rather dashing things in his youth. I you know what? I would be happy for my kids to be tutored by Rory Stewart. I probably hope to do some kind of after-hours correction of some attitudes. But clearly, in many important respects, he's a high caliber man.
Have you watched that interview with him when he's talking about heroism?
No, but I know that there are these accounts of him kind of really looking up to figures of the past.
Exactly.
So I suspect he's a great devotee of his heroes.
There's an interview when he's in his first couple of years as being an MP, 2012 maybe. I think it was 2010 intake, I think. And he's being interviewed about his love of Alexander the Great and Caesar and whatnot, and whether there is a kind of role for the hero in modern statesmanship. And you just see him like wrestling in this interview with that question. And he kind of concludes there's something a bit absurd about trying to lead this like really heroic vision for himself and his role when his sort of day-to-day is negotiating tenancy agreements for the kind of upland farmers of Cumbria. So big recommendation to watch that interview because you see his soul laid bare, I think.
I mean, I think that on that point of the role of the hero or the
outsized individual.
Yeah, exactly. The great man, in that term, is potentially hidden part of our problem, right? Which is man. In that, we are three blokes sitting around here drinking ale, talking about the need to sneak into the girls' dorms. But what we have not necessarily discussed is how a lot of women have actually been benefited from potentially the rise of credentialism, the clarification of expectations, the
assault on horseplay.
But the increase in the legibility of progress, that actually it is a lot simpler or clearer to make progress in a way that doesn't feel unearned or doesn't look unearned because of some quality that you've not necessarily
put the work in for.
Yeah, exactly. You put the work in and achieved in a fair way. There was a good essay by the Substack or Twitter account Kitten in response to Helen Andrews' piece about the great feminization in Compact magazine, about how actually we want feminization and we want fewer disruptive individuals because they make a mess and they're dangerous and they're unruly, and it would be a lot more convenient if boys could sit still in classes and learn their times tables and not whack each other. And not necessarily having whacked anyone myself, but I've heard that others do. Do you think that I mean, what your children are boys?
One boy, one girl, and one to be decided, to be seen in a couple of hours or days' time.
Oh, you don't know?
No, we don't know.
What?
No.
Well, of course, the child's got to decide their own gender. So this is all by the by.
Athelstania, I guess. So, no, I mean, you mentioned Civic Future, and Pamela very kindly shared a draft of her great new book on HR with me a few weeks ago. And it starts with this great Matthew Eliot poem about great qualities being torn down. And she fears that the rise of the sort of HR compliance mindset has led to a smothering of the spirit. That's the kind of guiding principle of her book. So I suppose that's the negative take on it, is that I feel like schools are particularly prone to this lack of confidence in great qualities and a kind of smothering of the spirit. Whether that's to the national good or not, I don't know. I mean, can you make boys, sit still and not whack each other? Seems quite hard to do. I know you wanted to speak about Michaela, and maybe that's a good kind of transition in, because Michaela's got a approach to schooling which its critics call behaviorist. It's got a very tight paradigm for behavior, and they certainly do manage to kind of combine control of boys' instincts with a kind of quite a patriotic curriculum. I'm sure you guys have read about memorizing and then reciting.
Well, for listeners' benefit, this is inner city comp. You're not allowed to talk in the corridors. No. Very strict rules about uniform.
Well, and you're not even allowed to be on your own at lunch, right? You have a teacher sits at every table and guides the table through structured conversation.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys haven't been for lunch there, or if listeners haven't been, they should definitely go. Yes, open. You need to register for lunch, and you sit there and. Yeah, you're on a table with 6 kids. You get given a topic to talk about over this very brief lunch, 15, 20 minutes. You're just gobbling down your food and having to talk about this one theme. And I think the theme of my last visit there was something like, what are we grateful for? Actually, no, it was in the Olympics. So it was about sport. Are there limits to the will to win, which we are... would condemn in some way. So is winning at all costs the right thing? And so we had this very detailed conversation about that. And then the most extraordinary thing, at the end of lunch, you heard about this thing called gratitudes?
No.
Where, they're like, right, everyone, 5-10 minutes of gratitudes. And it's who's grateful for something? And pretty much every hand in the school shoots up. and they're like heartbreakingly beautiful. There's this like 12-year-old kid like, I'm so grateful to my friend sitting next to me, because when we went on a school trip yesterday, he gave up his seat to an old lady, and it was just wonderful to see. And then the school goes, right, 2 claps for that, clap, and the whole school did it. And it's kind of like, it's a very anthropological question about whether that kind of habit formation is freeing or restricting. But I think, to your question about boys, that behavioural approach does seem to work. It doesn't. It gives it enough allowance for the spirit to grow, whilst keeping control of their behaviour. And I suppose the old private schools have managed to do that quite well through sports and other things too.
But it was easier for the private schools because they could separate the girls from the boys, which Michaela doesn't do.
What, and you think that that's a big part of it? Is that?
Well, I think you can allow I think different cultures emerged in classrooms. I mean, I wouldn't know. Never been in a classroom with girls after the age of 11 or so, but that allows some elements of specialization.
But boys do better in classrooms with girls. Like that was quite interesting about my school, is that girls came in
academic performance.
Girls came in the sixth form, and the girls were basically sacrificed to the boys because the boys girls do worse in mixed classrooms, right? Because the boys are disruptive, and we were I don't know. Flirting? I don't think as a 7-year-old I knew, a 17-year-old I knew
around,
yeah, exactly. But like that to me is I mean, you're right about the public schools. I would question whether there is some threshold, because none of us threw chairs at each other at my school, that maybe boys can be tolerated once they reach some threshold level,
or once you get rid of the most disruptive boys.
And that's the unspoken secret at Michaela, is that when kids are applying to the school, Catherine Burbelsing herself and her amazing staff, they give a kind of lots of warning shots to the prospective parents, saying, this is the strictest school in the country. We only want kids to come here who can abide by these set of rules. And she really lays it on thick, so that any parent who's like, not so sure that my kid will be able to cope here, just don't end up applying. So it's non-selective formally, but informally, it has a lot of parents who already have quite disciplined, home lives, I think. And so they have a kind of locus of control that they can then put into the school.
But is it going to be any easier for them to expel a child than it is for another school? But I mean, that's supposed to be a big problem, that if you have like a violent child, it's now legally very difficult to remove them, even if that's at the cost of the safety of the other students.
My understanding is that they exclude a small percentage of kids from particularly from the early years, and it's still possible to do that. I think you're right that the exclusion policy has been really questioned by Bridget Phillipson. Generally, they want to be inclusive rather than exclusive, but still, someone as canny as Catherine and her team know how to get rid of people.
So Bridget Phillipson, who's obviously the education secretary, she wants it to be even harder. Is that what you were saying?
Harder to exclude, yeah.
To exclude.
And Michaela, I mean, you're quite complimentary, and I think a lot of people are. Others are horrified by what, you call it behaviourist, smothering the spirit. I've heard people refer to it as sort of cockroach living, that you are turning humans into sort of ants, and this is the reality of dealing with broken or dysfunctional families, on that patriotic thing, not having a coherent national culture, so it has to be sort of inculcated from externally.
They're not going to know Shakespeare, they're not going to know kind of the unspoken social rules, and so
and the provocative line is I think it was Robert Toombs said it, and it provoked a sort of furore, was girls in hijabs reciting Kipling, which is a very, very strong aesthetic image. Where do you think, we talked about the need for coherent culture, and potentially this is what's needed for Britain as a sort of national project to maintain any kind of Britain, but that it's also different from how things have potentially taken place in the past? How do you feel about that?
Great question, and it's a real tension. And I think Pimlico Journal have done 2 or 3 pieces on Michaela, and the critic as well, that are rightly quite sceptical of the smothering, you'd call it, or the kind of the strident behaviorism that they manifest as their culture. So I think it's definitely there, and I suppose the question is like, at what cost is that environment? I think when you go to the school, when you see the kids with the huge smiles on their face, singing out Jerusalem, it's hard not to think, I just wish there were loads more schools like this across the country. Yes, it may be a slight indictment of where we are as a society. It feels quite American in terms of its kind of race relations approach, which we've got, hundreds of thousands of kids in this country that don't have any shared, norms. So we just need to kind of create these like slightly false national myths through God Save the King, Jerusalem, and Kipling, and sort of shove it into them and try and, this is where we are multiculturally. But I do quite like those myths, and I think although it is it's a kind of revealing of where we are as a country, I don't know what other solutions sort of we have other than this sort of project of trying to integrate many people from many different cultures and backgrounds into a collective. So I'm really pro it. Where I sort of, I guess, two objections to it. One of them is that it is quite demonstrably unscalable, and although some parts, particularly of the behaviour, have been adopted by other schools, this idea that some people have that you could just have lots of other Michaelas across the country just seems slightly for the birds. Catherine is a unique person, and I think you get diminishing returns once you expand that school out more and more. And the second is a bit like what I was saying earlier. Its ethos is striverist, and I think if you look at where those kids are going to end up, they will probably be in the so-called FIRE industries of finance, insurance, real estate, accounting, law. Are they being directed to the national project in any meaningful sense? We haven't seen the fruits of Michaela yet, but I worry that the kind of that totemic social mobility project of like, we're taking these kids from disadvantaged backgrounds and getting them into Russell Group universities only goes so far about, in terms of like, what then? what are these kids going to do to renew and revitalize the country? And I think maybe that's not up to Catherine to decide, but as we in wider society need to work out ways to connect up these amazing kids with national future in some way.
We've talked about this closing of the educational gap or the attainment gap as a key priority. I wonder and I think we are all potentially skeptical of it and more open to the idea of the great individual. You said, how do these people join together to the national project? Where do you see that coming from? Because clearly it is a good thing, for example, to have a population that can read and write.
Yeah.
And that was a useful Victorian feature of society and education, right? That you can send people off and they will write in a legible hand. Might that be better? That to have a generally well-educated population, I mean, in a sort of Singaporean style, you're maybe not going to produce vast intellects, but actually that doesn't really matter. Or at least they will be good in the sort of striverist way, i.e. they might be good at legible competitions, mathematics Olympiads, and that's enough, because actually there are worse things to have in the world.
I think, if I'm right, you're talking about two slightly different things. So I think there's the dirigiste education policy at the large scale, like a Singaporean type system, and how do we just increase that? And I suppose my recent thinking is that the gains that could have been made on that, to some extent, have been made, and that there's something quite inertial about our school system, that even Michael Gove and Cummings, they were there for a long time with this guy, Nick Gibb. huge amounts of like bloodletting and political capital was spent on the free schools movement and the curriculum changes. And then if you look at what was achieved, there have been some absolute gains. We talked about phonics earlier, phonics screening test and stuff like that. But although we made relative progress in the PISA tables, our absolute progress is still is fairly unremarkable. All the gains that we made were lost in COVID. So I guess I'm just a bit pessimistic that we have the political culture, the SW1 culture, to do a Singapore or an East Asian economy to actually advance at the median level, someone in a profoundly transformative way. So I guess I'm, of course, I think that will happen anyway. I think good people, good teachers, good civil servants will be trying to use the DFE to good. I guess my background in tutoring and at the margins of education makes me think that there might be some stuff at the margins that could help there. And I think the second part of your point around the elites, let's say the top of the distribution, what could be done there? At the moment, I think it is just a bit of a brain drain that the GCSE system and the employment system just leads to these, we're just not nearly ambitious enough for these kids. And I think we do have these like incipient things within our culture, like maths Olympiads, physics Olympiads, computer science Olympiads, which at the moment only have about 600 or 700 entries a year. But I think by sort of revitalizing this question of prizes and getting some exciting, compelling, and perhaps using, things like YouTube and streaming to sort of bring visually compelling, status-driven, prestige sprinkling effect to intellectual high performance. You could kind of energize that cohort to do greater things, and I think our future disproportionately relies on those people. And at the moment, if you go through a maths Olympiad, you're still, your track is towards finance and being a quant in some hedge fund. You're never really ever get your mind turned to, well, how could I go and work in industries or sectors which have a larger bearing on the public sphere? And so I'd really like to see that, and I'd also really like to see them sort of brought into some kind of cohort. And that's where I think where the French do that so much better with their Grande École, because from the age of, when you start your prépa, which I think is about 18, you're already beginning to think of yourself as
an elite,
serving the nation in some way. Loath as I am to borrow too much from the French, but I think on that model, I think we could learn a lot.
But perhaps you're in the coming school of thinking that degrees like PPE are totally outdated, and that what our incipient elites actually need. Well, he calls it an Odyssean education, and I mean, to my recollection, I suppose it's like calculus and biotech and whatnot. Is that the way that, I mean, would you take a cudgel to the universities, get rid of, well, maybe you wouldn't get rid of an institution like PPE, but there's a lot of damage that I imagine you might like to do.
Yeah, so I think the essay is definitely well worth rereading, the Odyssean education one from Cummings. And he's quite interesting because he says that just as Periclean Greece, Athens was like the school of Greece at the time, England, I think he wrote in 2014, could be like the school of the world. And we could work out how to do science education and like statesman education in a way that could be genuinely, additive to the world. And he uses that to answer that Dean Acheson quip of like, Britain's lost an empire but hasn't worked out its role. And he's like, this is the answer. So I think it's very suggestive. It's very STEM orientated, so there's very little on sort of the humanities and ethics. But I think in my dream future, because I'm interested in these like things at the margin, we have in this country now, thanks to Cummings, these great math schools like the King's Math School. I just think we should be looking to try and develop much more of these, and we should have like an Odyssean version of that from the age of 14, 15, 16, which is much more civic orientated, and they're reading their Thucydides, their Li Kuan Yu, those sorts of texts from a young age, and you get these kind of cohort effects. Just like in the Grammys recently, the Brits school, absolutely outperformed everyone else. So we've got the building blocks in this country for treating, and obviously in sports we do this very well as well, of treating outsized talent in a special way. But it's still so thin on the intellectual side.
Right, so specialised schools would be something you'd be attracted to. You'd be anointed at the age of 16 as a potential statesman.
Yeah. Or invited to do the Odyssean curriculum in some shape or form. If you then end up wanting to go and work as a lawyer, so be it. But you've at least been exposed to it.
Is the risk not like the sort of Hermann Hesse book, the glass bead game, right? That you produce a divorced Castalian elite who have you read?
I haven't. No,
you haven't?
I like the description.
These boys are selected out into the elite school, and they go to a region, a special Castalian region, and they have a specific curriculum, and they become great thinkers. And the pinnacle of this is the glass bead game, which is a game so abstract that you're dealing with all ideas and how they blend into each other. And it's reflections on how plants grow mixed with Mozart's compositions, mixed with the grammar, of ancient Sanskrit. I wonder whether we are. These things are obviously nice, but they become difficult to. They're not very legible, are they? And I think that's potentially why mathematics has been easier to privilege, because there have clearly been gains to people being good at maths or being good at physics. What's your kind of argument for why this stuff actually matters? Like, why should someone learn ancient Sanskrit? Is that not effectively intellectuals of onanism? How can that achieve? Should it even achieve a kind of similar prestige or value?
I'm fairly utilitarian. I don't think people should be studying Sanskrit unless they particularly want to. I like the idea of like applied educations. The Odyssean curriculum is very practical, really. It's learning Machiavelli and Thucydides to apply it to modern questions of geopolitics. So I'm not arguing for anything too rarefied, I don't think. Having said that, I think we have to reckon with the fact that we have an elite, we have a group of people who are decision makers, who have an outsized influence on us at the moment, and they've all gone through, slightly crappy PPE style, university education. Not all of them, but many of them have. And, they obviously have a kind of ethic. I mean, you look at the Chagosian scandal that we've been talking about earlier, but they have an ethic which is much more kind of, as I say, like managerial, legalistic than anything which is sort of glorious to some shape or form. So I guess I'm in favour of taking the notion of elite cohorts seriously and then thinking about, okay, what does this group need which will bring benefits to our country? And I think that because we've been so nervous about the whole concept of elites, we've sort of shied away from that question.
Feels like the thing missing from discussion of elite education is a sort of compact between the anointed elites and the rest of us. I don't particularly mind if someone gets a better education than me if the idea is that they then make the country better. I feel that there needs to be a kind of legible kind of understanding, basically.
Well, how can there be? Because if you do better, by rights, you are better. Therefore, why should you be like held back or shackled to the proles, to the pedestrian masses?
But this was the central argument by Michael Young in The Rise of the Meritocracy, where he was like, the big problem with an elite which is at the top of society by its own merits, they feel that they owe nothing to the rest of the country. Whereas in a more aristocratic age, you could never, believe that you were there based on your own worth. Just it was an accident of birth, really.
I mean,
Yeah.
Pinafore that we watched yesterday. There's a great reversal right at the end where spoilers. Listeners. No.
It's been out for 150 years.
Yeah, exactly. If you haven't done it, your fault. But little Buttercup reveals that the humble tar was in fact swapped with the captain at birth, and thus the tar is really the captain, and the captain is really the tar. And this like embarrassment that one group is put above another is sort of almost incidental, and as you said, thus noblesse oblige is necessary as a way of balancing that out. Christopher Lasch also writes about this, right? That a genuinely better elite is a terrifying thing.
Yeah.
And you can understand it. Why should I give a damn about stupid people?
Because you're connected to the country. Yeah. I mean, the problem is that our elites have become very globalized and quite divorced from their own locale. And again, it was much better in some respects when you had local elites who were there again, not because they worked and strived really hard at school, but because they just were, and therefore when it worked at its best, they had a notion of obligation to the people around them because they were kind of nested within that. So I think the Christopher Lasch and Toby Young's dad, their argument from the 1950s onwards, stacks up, and I think. Whether it's Lord Herner or all these people who are clearly the winners of the last 20 or 30 years, you look at them, they just don't seem to have a sense of obligation to their country.
I've got a different question on a slight change of tack. AI has completed the project of the Enlightenment in the sense that the question of the Enlightenment was that humans were sort of shackled by their lack or the inaccessibility of knowledge, and that when libraries could be opened, evening classes could be run, the internet and Wikipedia is set up, information would set people free. And LLMs have completed that in that now you don't just have the knowledge out there, you can ask a chat interface and pretty accurately receive the answer. Do you think this undermines a lot of the assumptions of the kind of education system that we've had over the last 200 years? One. And two, how do LLMs fit into this aristocratic tradition? There are already schools that use it, very expensive schools. I think the Alpha School is the example. And Math Academy, I think, is another very interesting example.
Yeah.
Two questions there for you, hospital pass, one after another.
No, not at all. No, I think Alpha School is really interesting. And a good friend of mine went to go for a visit there and said it was the most appalling experience that she'd ever had going around schools, because all of the kids are sat in these pods, basically. I will not live in the pod. These kids are in the pod and then it was like on the 35th floor of some New York skyscraper. So they were kind of in these incredibly instrumentalist pods, not allowed to communicate with other kids and just stuck in front of a screen the whole time. And she made the point that when you're going around to school, you rarely see that many kids having tantrums. She saw like 4 tantrums just in her one school visit. So there's something incredibly reductive and kind of aesthetically displeasing about that vision of education, I think. So that's when I think about AI education or AI tutoring, I go to aesthetics first, because I think the reality of kids sitting in front of screens for a long period of time is just, horrifying. We know from their attention it doesn't work that well as well. And although lots of adult teachers and researchers get huge amounts of benefit out of AI, that doesn't necessarily mean that children will too. So one thing is like an aesthetic displeasure of it at it. The second is around, I guess where I'm coming from this tutoring thesis is the, as I said, like this mimetic quality of captivating a younger student through tutoring one-on-one. And once you have that desire to learn, then the world is your oyster and you can get huge amounts of benefit from AI. But AI tutors and AI experiences themselves have not worked out how to do motivation well. They're kind of cheap, at its best, a kind of Peloton-esque level of like gamification. Oh, great, you got through this question, you get an extra gold star. It's a very sort of, again, behaviorist, but in a very depressing way. So I think kids need that relational sense of like seeing someone who they're impressed by and they admire to say, you know what is really cool to read is War and Peace, and I think you'd love it. An AI is never, well, at the moment, an AI is not able to kind of capture that motivational sense. And then the last thing is this, AI is often like held out as like personalized, so it's really good for like adapting to a child's own interests. But children do not need education adapted to their interests. They need to have their interests adapted to what's important to learn. And children don't know what they don't know. And so AI, again, it's a sort of a category error to think of AI as being really useful for anyone who doesn't have the cognitive maturity to really push themselves forward. But I'm willing to be sort of dissuaded by that, or at least to have that pushback, because I know you've got a big interest in it, Calum. And
well, I have seen, and this is kind of links back to that first question I asked about the sort of promise of the Enlightenment, right? Which is at an unconference this summer, I asked like, how do we explain the fact that, so I have taught myself hardware engineering through LLMs.
Yeah.
I sat in front of the chat window and I said, right, how do I build a robot?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll need a microcontroller, I'll need a driver board, I'll need a brushless DC motor, and it will run on this voltage. What's voltage? And then
that's awesome, yeah.
And you keep pursuing these like things down. But I think you're right that I only did it because I had the impression that this was an important thing to do. The motivation was intrinsic rather than extrinsic. But the fact that this is available now and people are not doing it, to me, is extremely threatening to the idea that all humans have this sort of special talent within them that could be unleashed. That, you could have been the best skateboarder, or you could have been the best oboist. It produces a deeply, I think, sort of reactionary or, ultra conservative almost attitude of humanity.
That's where Eric Hoel's essay starts. I think the subtitle is "Why We Stopped Producing Einsteins," and he's like,
"Is this one? Where did the Beethovens go? About like the low-hanging fruit? Or like, why do we?"
It's
maybe a different one.
Related. So it's one Tom mentioned earlier, where he talks about what happened to aristocratic tutoring, basically. And he says, he's like, one of the most naked conclusions that you have to draw from the internet, and I guess now from AI, is that it wasn't about the information availability, basically, I guess, to what you're saying. That there were obviously so many, that was a big constraint in the past, was, when a book was chained to a desk and you had this massive desire for knowledge and you just couldn't find the person or the knowledge to activate it. But now obviously it's there. And so we've done something bad to intrinsic motivation to learn, because we should be seeing, and that's why you're saying, like, where are all the Einsteins? Where is this new generation in the last 20, 30 years who have used the internet to teach themselves untold knowledge? So as you say, it says something really radical about the learning, the educational enterprise to some extent, that we just haven't seen that.
Well, doesn't it say something about the fact that all this stuff online is bundled together? So if you had given ChatGPT to a young Einstein, he would have been like a pig in shit. He would have had an amazing time.
Yeah.
But the problem is that you cannot give a child ChatGPT without also giving them Instagram and TikTok and any other, and YouTube and any other form of instant gratification.
Yeah.
If you can give them if you have a sort of Chinese firewall, or like an Anglo-futurist firewall's internet for children.
Hedgerow. The great hedgerow.
Yeah.
The great hedgerow of Britain. Yeah. Lovely.
Impose that on their screen time, And maybe we will find that there'll be more Einsteins, Beethovens, Drysdales.
Have you seen the experiment done in Australia? Was it Australia? Where they took phones out of. I was asked about it recently, that they took phones out of the classroom, and within a week, all of a sudden,
Well,
people
they
were
banned under 16s from social media.
yeah, and people were playing games
exactly,
and forming clubs and groups. That to me
I mean,
is
they're also going to other social media sites and like getting on the dark web and learning
the
how to use
VPNs and
VPNs.
stuff.
I think there are probably
Yeah.
different stories you can tell about this, and the results are not in.
yeah. I think that's
But one likes to think that they've got kind of hoops and sticks, and they're chasing the hoops down the road and like hoisting their petticoats as they pursue each other.
a good game of cup and ball.
Some of the English stories from banning smartphones are like they rediscovered Uno and all these like trad 1950s games.
Every now
puzzles.
and then I do a dopamine fast where I just don't use screen. I mean, it's a while since I've done it, but it might be a day or two. And
has to stop talking to me because I'm so stimulated.
I did it a few years ago, and by nightfall, I was able to just pick up a book and read it indefinitely and read an entire book in an evening.
Amazing.
As I was able to do basically before a smartphone fell into my sticky hands in my late teens.
Yeah.
So I'm optimistic actually that you would see quite quick results if you were able to create that kind of environment.
I agree.
And there are signs of this, right? There's sort of growing parental attitudes or
Well, even
movements.
among adults, like our friend Lily has a brick,
well,
like a flip phone.
James Marriott.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I bought the Quinn F21 Pro because
Unfortunately,
having read.
me too, but it doesn't have WhatsApp.
It does. I can.
You have a different
I'll,
Quinn.
no.
Pro
I can jailbreak it for you.
Okay.
So you can reflash it and remove all the Chinese spyware. So I've figured out how to do all that. So I can do that for you if you want.
I
Excellent.
actually have one in the flat. That'd be amazing.
Yeah. And then you flash like Dumb Droid onto it, which is kind of an open source distribution. But I know I'm progressive, but also these groups of parents getting together and doing this with their children, because that to me feels more sustainable maybe than doing single parent, single child or for you children, right? That you can slightly spread the load over groups, but it requires you to agree on some pretty fundamental precepts.
Yeah, I've been a part of this campaign called Smartphone Free Childhood. 300,000 parents across the country, all forming these local pacts. It's a kind of amazing reflowering of like civic Britain, where the local groups of parents are getting together and signing these like digital chastity pacts with each other, saying we're not going to give our kids a smartphone until this age, and then when we do, we're going to put these bounds in place. So I think this is a natural response to what a lot of us, who grew up with the internet, feel about what we want for our kids and what we don't. Whether it will create that kind of, the Einstein, I think that's the bigger question. I think we can definitely create a childhoods or recreate childhoods with more free play, more human and tangible goods and whatnot. But whether you could kind of sprinkle this prestige in such a way that you get kids to then use that time to read. I mean, I'm quite interested by this like book talker movement, where you get these like 14-year-old American kids reading Dostoevsky and then posting about it and saying, this was like changed my life and whatnot. We probably need more of that for this generation to sort of actually make the case for it, rather than just...
Is there not also like, I read this fairy porn as well?
Yeah, I'm sure there is, yeah. But I think, if it's just a kind of adult project saying, look, actually books are really great, I think it's obviously not going to work. So we need young people to use the social media tools available to promote this stuff too. But that's where I come back to this like Olympiad vision, where, and I think your question about legibility is so interesting. Like what is a legible achievement in history or in politics? I spoke a little bit about Daisy Christodoulou's work before we started recording. I think comparative judgment's very, very interesting. But I think we will begin to see in the kind of post-AI era, much more memory and much more kind of oral performance. So I'm quite interested in these like medieval memory palace ideas. And if a kid could like memorize the wasteland again by using a memory palace and then display it in a really cool way online, which didn't seem like showing off. I mean, it sounds hard to achieve, but I think there's some promise there.
You can almost imagine a child or a nation as a tube of toothpaste, or maybe a slowly regenerating tube of toothpaste, and you can get it all out in one go, but in doing so you break you break the tube or whatever.
The John Stuart Mill.
Exactly. The example of a highly active and impressive tutoring. Do you think that focusing on child attainment in this way, i.e. everyone should do well, is ultimately self-defeating, that we're sort of exhausting we're mortgaging the future to pay for a momentary flash of brilliance?
Totally. No, I think that is the tutoring culture that we are going to go increasingly towards if we're not careful, which is generally Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea. They have, there's a reason why tutoring is prohibited after 10 p.m. in South Korea, is because these, I can't remember the Korean phrase for it, but you have these tutoring centers which go like long into the night if they're not regulated, because they're so striverist and they're going after these like incredibly legible, empirical, meritocratic tests. And it is so brutal that it's like if you put in the extra hour than the other person, you have a chance of getting 1% more, and you're going to get into the top university in Korea and then go and be hired by a Samsung or one of these big Korean conglomerates. So that's another. I've been in this world for the last 20 years of the most ambitious families in the world. We've got an office in Singapore and Hong Kong and London. They want their kids to succeed at almost all costs, at any cost. Or they would think it's a worthy cost if their child got into a top university and then was able to get into a Goldman Sachs or whatnot, deal with the mental health issues later on. And so we've got this situation where it is an incredibly stressful experience for the children, but for educational material that in itself is not that rigorous. So like non-verbal reasoning or these sort of things, they've got no enduring educational value at all. Like if it was like, right, you've got to read Dostoevsky, at least there would be some that's like, okay, I went through it, but it might stay with me for the rest of my life. But for most of these competitive entrance exams, you forget it the moment you're through it. So it's sort of highly, highly stressful and no enduring value really whatsoever beyond your own personal, career, LinkedIn, trajectory. And that's where, I don't know whether you read this guy, Daniel Markovits, who's like very good on kind of elites, but he talks about the thing at the moment is like your own human capital is like an asset that you're always constantly trying to like increase through tutoring and education to get into the next thing. And so he says elite kids are asset managers of their own human capital. And so they're constantly like depleting their own capital by trying to strive to the future. And I suppose what I was trying to argue in this Inkling tutoring essay was to try and expand definitions of what educational flourishing looks like to things which have intrinsic goods beyond just going through the motions.
I struggle with it simply because, following that model of the human capital management, the Scott Alexander essay, the Moloch.
Yeah.
In that he lays out that culture or cultural practice are possible on the plateaus of the sort of techno-economic gradient slide, right? In that you can afford that in fat periods where there isn't an extremely linear relationship between time, effort, and capital. And the problem now is if you read Dostoevsky,
you're losing out.
Because actually the expected return of Dostoevsky is not high enough for it to be worth an exchanging an hour, well, let's be honest, 40 hours maybe, of Kumon.
Yeah.
Like that's the real problem, isn't it? That and although like it might be nice and but it's a sort of public good in the same way that the the sewers are. But no, it takes almost a state mandate to create the sewers. Do we need a state mandate that everyone has to read Shakespeare?
Well, here's where I disagree, because I think that way of thinking about human capital is like perfect for a professional managerial system, which is all about, it's very empirical, it's very managerial, but it doesn't answer that question of kind of motivation and why you're doing things. And if you look at people like Tyler Cowen, who we were speaking about before we started recording, he wrote this book a couple of years ago called Talent, and he was like profiled all the top talent recruiters in Silicon Valley and whatnot. And their questions when they're trying to recruit people are like, tell me about the tabs that are open on your laptop, or what are you doing in your spare time, which is like a pianist practicing their scales. Like what skills are you developing there? And I think that, hopefully we're moving into an economic, and this is why it's not really a schools thing, but we're entering into an employment situation where kind of what you love and why you're doing something is going to be as important as just like the sheer productive outputs of what you're doing. So that in that case, I think we have to hope that Dostoevsky gives us something, in some broader definition, utilitarian. It's not just a nice to have; it's something genuinely that could change you.
Could you tell us what you want from your children's education?
Can I put in one joke before you say that?
Okay, queuing up my loss.
It turns out that the answer to Bentham, like McIntyre, is, when you run the maths, McIntyre is the answer to Bentham, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, tell us what you want from your own children's education. Like, do you want to send them to Oxbridge? Do you want to cultivate bravery and
or
curiosity? Sorry, or imperial. Does it make sense to have outcomes like this in mind?
Yeah, great question. I think about it every day. I think I'm strongly believe that knowledge is its own reward, and that I want them to be like vitalized by the stuff that they have learned. So when I think about the history curriculum, for the history I want them to know, if they ever go to Parliament, I want them to be walking through that great chamber on the way to the lobby, where you see all those statesmen there, and to be able to know who they are and to feel that they're having a kind of participatory relationship with something in their direct view because of what they've learned. And if they're walking through the countryside, I want them to know every tree. I want them to be able to listen to birdsong and to be able to recognize it. So I feel like educationally properly done is a vitalizing force which kind of enchants your everyday perception. And it should be. So therefore, if you are on the kind of economic scrap heap, you've at least got some goods to keep hold of. But of course, as someone who went to good schools and universities and have lots of friends, I do want it to be productive as well, and for them to be canny enough to be able to know the paths towards making good, prosperous lives for themselves. Much of which is outside their hands. Whether they can afford good housing, whether they can have a well-paid job, is not really directly up to them. But I want them to be, if I want them to be able to seize those goods if they, if they have the talent to do so, and be, look after us in our dotage and be good people. I'd much rather that they have the moral courage to go against the grain. A friend of mine often talk about this, that if they're in a room of 1,000 people and 999 are saying you have to sign this document, you don't agree with it, but you have to sign it in order to achieve this, to at least have the moral courage to say no to that. That would be, another great achievement as a parent.
How do you teach that?
I think through example. I'm very persuaded by this lady, Linda Zagbetsky, called Exemplarist Virtues, which is about putting in front of children loads and loads of moral examples of lives where they have done this, and trying to be quite didactic about that. So trying to show, people who have, what was that amazing film, Franz Jägermeier, the Austrian guy, who what was it called? A Little Life, was it? Or A Fragile Life. It was in the Nazi occupation. The whole village just wanted him to kind of comply with and to keep their heads down. But he just had a moral objection to it and couldn't, and ended up losing his life over it. It's about trying to kind of show thousands of those moral examples to the kids. And of course you can't force them to do it, but you're trying to make that something that we're looking up to.
Do you, before we wrap up, I want to ask, do you see any conflict in that? Sort of the sort of higher up on Maslow's hierarchy ideas of self-actualization, moral virtue, things like that, and the lower ones, i.e., there's a book that our producer very likes a lot called The Decline of the Industrial Spirit.
Martin Weiner.
Yeah. And a central tenet of that is you have a whole load of striver, quite sharp-elbowed industrialists who then send their children to Eton, and they're totally ruined by it, and all the positive virtues that they have developed over a life of graft are wasted on claret and parties for the glorious 12th. Do you see any conflict? I mean, I of course, the recruiters and the talent, but there was a Drupka Kunli tweet about what happens when the East Asians discover like virtue and wonder and the Kumon style. Now it's you've
pleasure
got
for its own sake,
10 sets of meditating upon the oneness of the world, and 3 hours of writing about.
I got 100% on my courage exam.
Yeah, exactly. And now you will be put through your moral virtue, resistance to peer pressure test.
Well, you get already, I think Singapore was quite taken by some of the Western ideas. So it's like thinking outside the box. And it's like, I've seen worksheets like, here's the box. here's where you have to think. So, no, I think it's such a good challenge. And I love that book. It was such a kind of confrontational read for so many of my priors reading that book. I really like David Edgerton's book on the post-war Britain, because he shows that so many of the elites, and even in the House of Lords, were also kind of industrialists as well. And I think you had, what have you got, like Lord Nuffield and all from Oxford, the motor car company, the person that founded Unilever, is the Lord Leveson, as he called. You had this like profusion of landed elites who'd been to these fancy schools in some way, who were also putting their shoulder to the industrial post-war rebuilding of the country. So I think it's probably too simplistic, as he says, to like that they were all this like, I think he says they're very nostalgic and very in love with like rural pursuits that were totally sort of at odds with the industrial spirit to some extent. And then I just think you have to look at like what happened in the First World War, where all of these public school educated chaps, went and they went to go and slaughter themselves in the trenches. They did what was expected of them to some extent. So I don't think they were these sort of like dissolute, claret drinking, lot who were also kind of cowardly to some extent. They tragically were all too willing to just go and kill themselves in the front of front of their men. And then there's that great book 6 Weeks, which talks about them, their dying words were like, "Tell Uppingham that I died a hero's death," or please pass my best regards in the chapel to Charterhouse or whatnot. Thinking of their school before they were thinking of their families and their country. So I guess I think it's a really good challenge, and I don't have a very good answer to it. But it's no longer the case now. Like these top public schools are not turning out beautiful classicists who can only construe Greek prosody, they are actually very transactional in their educational philosophy, and they define themselves by how many kids they can get into Russell Group universities, and then these quite narrow group of professions. And again, I question that. I'd much rather that they had a slightly more Victorian conception of they were trying to make men or make character first and foremost, and then those people then had a duty to their country to some extent.
I mean, clearly there is a problem where, well, is it Goodhart's law, right? That when it becomes a metric, when producing men who are courageous or good will probably do well in classics.
Yeah.
Trying to teach people to be good at classics will produce men who are not good or virtuous.
Yeah.
So your ideal model of schooling, Will, is not the South Korean one. It's not the one we currently have. 50 years from now, what is the model of schooling that you would like to see in this country? Well,
one of the things that I'm so inspired by the kind of Anglo-futurist vision is this sort of, this marrying of old and new. I'm a big fan of Switzerland, which does that very well as well, where you've got a very low percentage of people going to university there. I think it used to be 8%. I think it's now like 15%. And, it's totally respectable to go and be a carpenter if you're to leave school and go and do that. So really like a lot of the stuff coming out of America around this idea of like what family formation looks like in the post-digital age, and where a lot of families might be working at least a few days a week like we do from home. And, that in some way reanimates the household as a site of production, and therefore, we've moved away from the Industrial Revolution and the kind of suburban model where families are just absenting the house in the day and going to work, and their kids are going to school. What I'm interested in is, again, this may not be a completely mainstream, but certainly a large minority of families are taking more ownership for their kids' school. They're working 1 or 2 days a week from home, and their kids are at home too. That education is not delivered through a screen, that it's done through tactile things like outside, but also at a kitchen table with books and pens and pencil, but that the parents are using the AI tools we talked about and screens themselves to get educated and to have the tools at their disposal, the resources to teach their kids. So I guess I see like a localized, reanimated village and civic life where parents are the partners with schools and local teachers in their kids' education. And then as I go back to this question of like knowledge is its own reward, I hope that James Marriott is wrong and that we're not living in a post-literate age, and that the enduring works of art and literature and history and scientific and mathematical knowledge endure 50 years hence, and that they continue to provide so much joy and interest as they have done for the last few hundred years.
Well, I hope that Calum and I can entrust our children and grandchildren with Inkling.
Yes.
Tell us about Inkling.
Well, Inkling is my argument that all of the energy of the tutoring industry, which it does very well in this country, is directed at these very narrow ends of exam and test prep. And I think there is a lot of delta kind of lying on the table. You can get extraordinarily well qualified academics, top Imperial and Oxbridge graduates who are working fairly menial jobs to make ends meet, to get an hour of their time sometime in your week. If you can't do this day a week that I do, you could do it on the weekends, a couple of hours a week to get them to be that like mimetic inspiration for your child, to say, what is cool and what's cutting edge at the moment with applied manufacturing, with AI, with drone building, etc. And just kind of light the fire for these young kids. That is just so achievable at the moment. It'll have all sorts of intrinsic and probably extrinsic benefits too. And far too few families are going for it. If they go for tutoring, it is to get good SATs results for their kids, or to get into good GCSE results, which have their place, but which are embarrassingly thin compared to what could be achieved.
Yeah. You talked there about the university. and we haven't really spoken about it, do you think those people are still up to scratch? I mean, I suppose you have to count that you would just find the good ones, right?
Yeah, I mean, we live outside Oxford, and I know a group of postdoc researchers there who are outstanding in their own field, and who for £30-40 an hour would happily come round and teach my kids. That just seems like an amazing deal, to be honest. Wider problems of the university, yeah, I mean, for me, the AI question that we spoke about earlier seems far more of an existential challenge for universities than it does for schools.
Well, Will, we won't draw you there into a question. How
do we fix the university?
Yeah, exactly. So we've already done 2 hours, and now we want to get into the topic of. We'll stop it there. This podcast focuses solely on the schoolroom, and the lecture hall will have to be resolved another time. Will, where can people read some of your work or find out more about you?
I've got a very little read Substack called The Lantern, so people can read me there or just reach out via that, and would love to chat.
And if they're interested in tuition,
the essay is published on Substack with this idea of inkling tutoring, and of course, if people want GCSE etc. Tutoring, then Keystone Tutors is the place to go.
Wonderful. Well, Will, thank you for coming on the show.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much. The school day is over.
Cash in. Hope you've been paying attention.
Yeah, exactly. You are our hope.